committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess of the committee at any time. Without objection, members of the full committee not on this subcommittee are authorized to participate in today's hearing. This hearing is entitled A Persistent and Evolving Threat: An Examination of the Financing of Domestic Terrorism and Extremism. I now recognize myself for 3 minutes to give an opening statement. Domestic terror poses a persistent and evolving threat of violence and economic harm to the United States. These are not my own words. That was framed by senior leaders within the FBI on the state of our country when appearing before Congress in June. The rate, pace, and lethality of domestic terrorist attacks have only grown more devastating since this testimony was delivered. In July, at California's Gilroy Garlic Festival, 4 people were killed and 17 were injured. August, in El Paso, Texas, 22 people were killed and 24 were injured. December, in Jersey City, New Jersey, as one of our witnesses is most painfully aware, 6 people were killed, including 1 police officer. 2019 saw the highest number of mass killings recorded to date, 211 killed in 41 incidents, according to data compiled by the Associated Press, USA Today, and Northeastern University. Acts of domestic terror were the driving force behind these numbers. This hearing presents us the unique opportunity to look past the politics that surround this issue to explore how we can confront and overcome this crisis. How may we most effectively follow the money to disrupt the financing of these crimes? How can we enable law enforcement and the financial services institutions to counter domestic terror financing? Congressman Wexton has a bill before us today, H.R. 5132, that requires the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, to issue an advisory to financial institutions about how loan actors and other domestic terrorists procure firearms. Congressman Gottemeyer has a bill that would freeze the assets of suspected terrorists and those that show support for terrorism. The bill would also create a clearinghouse for incidents of terrorism to be used to assist law enforcement as they try to follow the money. There's also a bill calling for the Government Accounting Office to study funding of domestic terrorism. The Wall Street Journal reported in 2018 that banks and credit card companies were discussing ways to identify purchases of guns in their payment system as a means of directly confronting the issue of mass killings. We must have a robust conversation on all these contours of this issue, including guns. I would remind everyone of the sensitivity surrounding this issue. There's a man today serving a 10-year sentence in Leavenworth Federal Prison for having tried to firebomb my district office in Kansas City. Our Congresswoman in our chair had 2 bombs mailed to her. Our House Minority Whip was shot and carries the wounds of that violence with him today. With these incidents in mind, I implore witnesses and members to exercise thoughtfully as we explore this issue. The chair now recognizes the ranking member for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman. Thank you for convening this hearing, and thank our witnesses for taking time today to be with us and present your views. This is a topic that members of the committee care deeply about. Over the past 5 years that I've served in Congress, I've served on the Illicit Finance Subcommittee during that entire period. I know we've had many hearings about terror financing and related topics, but I don't remember us focusing on and analyzing the issue from a domestic perspective. I look forward to a constructive dialogue about this pending threat. Violent extremism is considered a growing problem in this country. FBI Director Chris Wray testified before the Senate last year, stating that Homeland violent extremists are the greatest, most immediate terrorism threat to the homeland. Big statement. Furthermore, a report released by the Department of Homeland Security in September 2019 outlines domestic terrorism and mass attacks are as great a threat to the United States as foreign terrorism. Since 9/11, there have been 85 incidents of violent extremism committed, according to the GAO. This extremism has been impacting constituents in Arkansas all the way back to the 1980s. In 1985, current Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson, who was then a U.S. attorney, helped dismantle the operations of the Covenant, the Sword, and the Arm of the Lord a militia-style white supremacy group operating in North Arkansas. More recently, in 2009, a domestic radicalized Islamic extremist opened fire at the military recruiting station in my district in Little Rock, Arkansas, killing Private William Long of Conway, Arkansas, and wounding my friend, Private Quentin Ezagagwa from Jacksonville. These attacks are not isolated incidents, and we need to ensure as policymakers where we can better assist law enforcement efforts to track their funding and monitor their internet usage to inhibit the growth. Recent anti-Semitic attacks in the New York area are deeply concerning. The continued demonization of Israel through initiatives like the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement in this country are contributing to that anti-Semitic sentiment across our nation. I'm disappointed to report that last May in my home state, protesters interrupted a Holocaust Remembrance Day in Russellville, Arkansas, bearing signs with anti-Semitic language. I've long opposed the BDS movement and co-sponsored several bills to that effect, including our ranking member, Mr. McHenry's legislation in the 115th Congress. While I applaud the House for passing H.Res. 246 last July that opposes efforts to delegitimize Israel, but personally I don't think it went far enough. A watered-down, non-binding resolution isn't sufficient. I believe we should pass H.R. 336, Strengthening America's Security in the Middle East Act, being led by my colleague Mike McCall of Texas. Title IV of this legislation includes the Combating BDS Act, which would allow a state or local government to adopt measures to divest assets from entities using boycotts, divestments, or sanctions to influence Israel's policies. We need to create bipartisan solutions to ensure that violence and hatred does not continue to grow. I applaud the joint efforts of the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Justice, the FBI, and the National Counterterrorism Center, and what they've done to implement efforts to counter this violent domestic extremism. I encourage my colleagues today to think about ways the House Financial Services Committee can help underscore and contribute to the great work being done. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the chair of the full Financial Services Committee for such time as she may consume.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I thank you for convening this hearing on combating the financing of domestic terrorists like the white supremacy and sovereign citizen groups. While the U.S. has long focused on international terrorism, the FBI and DHS have confirmed that domestic extremists are now as big a threat here at home. We easily recognize their stain on cities across the U.S. in Charlottesville, Charleston, Gilroy, Pittsburgh, El Paso, Portland, on and on and on. Barely a day goes by before we hear of another violent attack on African Americans, Jews, Muslims, Latinos, LGBTQ persons, immigrants, women, and others targeted by, and most frequently, far-right hate groups. My staff and I were the targets of a recent domestic terror attack, receiving 2 pipe bombs from a right-wing Trump fanatic who also sent more than a dozen of these weapons to Democratic Party figures. President Trump's language that there are fine people on both sides and his willfully blind statements asserting that there is no global rise in white nationalism should concern all of us. Trump has not only failed to forcefully condemn the extremists, but he often encourages their abhorrent behavior. America cannot tackle the threat if we refuse to recognize it. And I'm eager to hear from the panel about what Congress should do to act forcefully where Trump has refused to do so. Our panel of experts today will help us to identify the bad actors and cut off funding for their radicalization and bad acts. And let me just say, Mr. Chairman, that fresh on our minds is the march that took place in Charlottesville, where we had white supremacists who were marching and chanting, "You will not replace us, Jews will not replace us." And in light of all that, the President of the United States thought there were good people on both sides. This is a serious hearing, and I'm very pleased that you're spending time to identify what is going on right here in our own country, and I look forward to working with everyone to ensure that we cut off all funding, not cut off funding, but deny funding, find funding, identify where the money is coming from, and do everything that we can to stop it. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Our first witness will be introduced by Congressman Godmer.
Thank you, Chairman Cleaver, for affording me the opportunity to introduce Jared Maples, the Director of the New Jersey Office of Homeland Security and Preparedness. And thank you, Chairwoman Waters, for your leadership to help combat domestic terror. Prior to joining Homeland Security, Director Maples spent more than a decade at the Central Intelligence Agency in several leadership roles, and previously worked at the Pentagon in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He leads an office on the front lines of the effort to protect New Jersey residents from a range of threats, and especially threats against our state's diverse religious communities. According to the New Jersey Office of Homeland Security annual reporting, homegrown violent extremists inspired by ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other terrorists remain the #1 threat to New Jersey. And in recent years, his office has ranked white supremacists as one of the highest threats as well. In recognition of his extraordinary leadership against domestic terrorists, white supremacists, anti-Semites, and other homegrown terrorists, the Anti-Defamation League of New Jersey and New York and New Jersey awarded Director Maples with its 2018 ADL Making a Difference Award, noting, quote, "Director Maples has made great strides in connecting communities of faith with each other and with law enforcement, bridging gaps in communication before emergency situations happen so that the New Jersey community can work together instead of individually before calamity strikes." On many occasions, unfortunately far too many, including just after the attack in Jersey City and in all the counties that I represent in my district, we have stood together and worked closely together to make sure that our first responders and our religious institutions, our synagogues, our churches, our mosques, and all communities have what they need to protect the state and all of our residents against the next terrorist attack. We are very, very lucky to benefit from his expertise and leadership, and I look forward to hearing from him today on this issue that affects all Americans, Democrats and Republicans, and I'm very, very grateful that you're here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Godmer. Our next witness is Lecia Brooks, who works in senior leadership as the Chief Workplace Transformation Officer at the Southern Poverty Law Center. Ms. Brooks previously served at the center's, as the center's outreach director, traveling around the U.S. and abroad to counter hate and extremism and to promote the celebration of differences. Our next witness is Rena Miller. Ms. Miller is a specialist in financial economics at the Congressional Research Service, focusing on anti-money laundering and countering terrorism financing. Previously, Ms. Miller has worked as a financial service attorney at Deschert LLP and at the Department of the Treasury. Our next witness is George Selim, who is currently the Senior VP of Programs at the Anti-Defamation League. He has previously served in both the Bush and Obama administrations, the inaugural director of the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Community Partnership, as well as various other leadership positions. Our next witness is Rena Miller, a specialist in financial economic. We've already introduced you. Our final witness is Mary McCord. We are pleased to have you. Ms. McCord served as legal director at the Institute of Constitutional Advocacy and Protection and the visiting professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center. She has previously served as Assistant Attorney General for National Security at the DOJ and an Assistant U.S. Attorney in the D.C. Appellate and Criminal Court. Thank you all for being here today. Witnesses are reminded that your oral testimony will be limited to 5 minutes without objection. Your written statement will be made a part of the record. Ms. Maples, you are recognized now for, Mr. Maples, for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Chairman Cleaver and Ranking Member Hill, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. It is an honor to speak with you and share information gathered by my office regarding sources of domestic terrorism funding as it impacts New Jersey and the country as a whole. The New Jersey Office of Homeland Security and Preparedness is tasked with coordinating counterterrorism, resiliency, and cybersecurity efforts across all levels of government, law enforcement, nonprofit organizations, and the private sector. Furthermore, we are charged with bolstering New Jersey's resources for critical infrastructure protection, preparedness, training, and federal grants management. Many domestic extremist attacks are committed by individuals unaffiliated or unassociated with a larger group network. Most of the cases I will discuss today highlight lone offenders who do not need large amounts of funding to conduct their operations, making it difficult to detect and prevent attacks. Common tactics in domestic extremist attacks include easily obtainable weapons such as knives, small arms, and vehicles. The cases I will mention have a direct nexus to New Jersey, but serve as examples of the kind of activity prevalent throughout the United States. My office assessed that many of these organized domestic extremist activities are funded through criminal enterprises, such as the illicit sale of counterfeit goods, drug and weapon trafficking, cigarette smuggling, and various fundraising methods. Lone wolf offenders will likely be self-funded in order to carry out their goals. Additionally, we cannot discount the future role of cryptocurrencies in funding acts of domestic extremism, both within New Jersey and across the U.S. NJOHSP has worked with many federal, state, and local government agencies during the course of investigations. While we provide details on our ongoing efforts, be mindful that we always seek to improve our approach towards preventing these incidents from occurring in the first place. The New Jersey Suspicious Activity Reporting System, or NJ-SARS, is part of an ongoing effort in New Jersey to increase our threat reporting, which is directly linked to the FBI's national SARS system known as eGuardian. Today, I will only highlight a few relevant case examples, starting with a recent tragedy. On December 10, 2019, 2 perpetrators killed 3 people and injured 3 when they targeted a kosher grocery store in Jersey City, shortly after killing Jersey City Police Detective Joseph Seals at a nearby cemetery. The shooters espoused anti-Semitic and anti-law enforcement views prior to the attack. This is an ongoing investigation, and we expect to learn more about possible funding sources once it has concluded. We do know that at least 2 black separatist extremist groups are active in New Jersey: the New Black Panther Party, or NBPP, and the Israelite Church of God in Jesus Christ, or ICGJC. Both groups promote violence and hate-based rhetoric against law enforcement, government officials, the Jewish community, and other ethnicities. In November 2016, the FBI served a search warrant related to financial irregularities at the ICGJC's organization headquarters in New York. The leader is a New Jersey resident and oversees churches in at least 10 states. The group is financially sustained through donations from members, and there have been allegations that the members are involved in financial scams that prey upon other members and sects. On April 13, 2018, the leader of Aryan Strike Force, Joshua Stever in Phillipsburg, Warren County, was arrested along with 5 other members of the group for conspiring to sell methamphetamine, firearms, and machine gun parts to fund the organization's activities. They stored firearms and ammunition at locations in New Jersey and Pennsylvania and transported methamphetamine across state lines. They laundered the illicit proceeds from the drug sales by purchasing Target gift cards, which they traded for illegal weapons. Sovereign citizens continue to engage in harassing tactics such as bogus liens and a variety of scams and fraud. Threats and ultimatums, attempted citizens arrests, takeovers of government or other buildings, and acts of violence, especially during traffic stop and residence visits, are common among the sovereign citizen movement. In May 2017, detectives from my office arrested a professed sovereign citizen for filing fraudulent liens, a first in New Jersey. Several of the largest scams involving sovereign citizens have brought in more than $100 million. Among the most common types of scams used are pyramid and other investment schemes, trust scams, real estate fraud, and various types of tax fraud, amongst immigration fraud and malpractice insurance fraud as they get more creative. In conclusion, we assess that organized domestic extremists will continue to fund activities through criminal enterprises, and lone offenders will likely be self-directed and self-funded in order to carry out their goals. Additionally, we cannot discount the future use of cryptocurrencies as a means to fund acts of domestic extremism within New Jersey and across the United States. Foreign terrorist organizations have used such platforms such as Facebook and Telegram to solicit funding through Bitcoin. In 2017, Andrew Anglin, publisher of neo-Nazi blog The Daily Stormer, received a donation after the Charlottesville attack in the amount of 14.88 Bitcoins, or approximately $60,000. We remain dedicated to continuing efforts to combat domestic terrorism and its sources of funding, to further collaborating with our law enforcement and private sector partners, and to work toward addressing threats with a focus on prevention. Chairman Cleaver, Ranking Member Hill, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, I thank you again for the opportunity to testify today. I look forward to your questions and yield back to the chairman.
Thank you very much. Ms. Brooks, you're now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Cleaver, Ranking Member Hill, and the Chairwoman, Maxine Waters. For For more than 3 decades, the Southern Poverty Law Center has been monitoring, issuing reports about, and training law enforcement officials on far-right extremist activity in the United States. Each year since 1990, we have conducted a census of hate groups operating across the United States. I'd like to make 3 main points today. First, we are witnessing a surging white nationalist movement in the United States that is part of a larger global movement linked by the idea that white people are being displaced in part by migrants in countries they believe should belong to them. Second, this movement is rooted in a toxic, anti-democratic, white supremacist ideology that is metastasizing on social media networks and other websites that traffic in hate. These networks are not only radicalizing people, but are in effect incubating new terrorists. Third, we would like to recommend ways in which technology companies, including social media sites and online pay portals, can disrupt the funding, organizing, and recruiting efforts of hate groups and bad actors who seek to normalize hate. On August 3rd, 2019, the United States witnessed yet another mass shooting, this time in El Paso, Texas, where 22 people were killed and more than 20 were injured. Shortly before the shooting took place, a 4-page manifesto appeared online, reportedly written by the shooter. The manifesto contained white nationalist talking points on demographic displacement, white genocide, and illegal immigration. Technology companies, especially social media platforms, play an enormous role in the spread of hateful rhetoric and ideas, which can lead to the radicalization of people online. Though the United States has since 9/11, devoted enormous resources to fighting international terrorism spawned by radical forms of Islam, it has done relatively little to combat another increasingly virulent source of terror, one that has claimed more lives in recent years, the white nationalist movement. According to SPLC's analysis, more than 100 people in the United States and Canada have been killed in attacks committed by extremists linked to the white supremacist movement since 2014. All the perpetrators interacted with extremist content online. Nothing has helped facilitate the process of far-right radicalization like the internet. The online radicalization narrative is now a terrifyingly common one. Before the days of the internet, far-right extremists typically had to publish and disseminate propaganda in printed form. Most Americans were simply never exposed to this material. Now, white nationalists commonly develop their views by coming into contact with extremist content online. Most people who associate with the white nationalist movement do not belong to a formal hate group, but act as a part of a loosely organized community of extremists who congregate around online propaganda hubs. There are entire online spaces, including the forum Fascist Forge, threads of social media sites, the Gab, Telegram, and many others that exist solely to provide training and advice on how to carry out acts of violence, to disseminate texts to promote racial terrorism, and to encourage followers to commit their own violent attacks. These online spaces are incubating future terrorists. For decades, the SPLC has been fighting hate and exposing how hate groups use the internet. We've lobbied internet companies one by one to comply with their own rules to prohibit services from being used to foster hate or discrimination. A key part of this strategy has been to target these organizations' funding. Hate group sites are primarily funded by peer-to-peer interactions, not by large donors. Even a small amount of money can go a long way in spreading hate online. These groups and individuals are able to spread their toxic ideologies far and wide through ads and events that cost relatively little. Public exposure is half the battle. Our campaign must continue in earnest. In October of 2018, the Change the Terms Coalition recommended policies for technology companies that would take away the online microphone that hate groups use to recruit members to raise funds and organize violence. We encourage this committee to do further research and support or encourage online platforms from removing their funding sources and preventing these ideas from reaching a wider audience and disrupting their networks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Selim, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Chairman Cleaver, Ranking Member Hill, Chairwoman Waters, thank you for this opportunity to present before the subcommittee this morning. As stated, my name is George Selim, and I currently serve as the Senior Vice President for National Programs at the ADL. For decades, ADL has fought against anti-Semitism and bigotry in all forms by exposing extremist groups and individuals who spread hate and incite violence. Today, ADL is the foremost non-governmental authority on domestic terrorism, extremism, hate groups, and hate crimes. ADL sits at the nexus of helping secure our communities from hate and extremism, protecting civil liberties, and advocating for change. I've served in multiple roles in our government's national security apparatus at the Department of Justice, Homeland Security, and at the White House on the National Security Council staff. Today, I oversee the efforts at ADL to investigate and expose extremism across the ideological spectrum. The threat of domestic extremism in the United States today is severe and urgent. In 2018, domestic extremists killed at least 50 people, a sharp increase from the 37 murders documented in calendar year 2017. Recent tragedies have struck in the form of attacks against Jewish worshipers inside a synagogue in Pittsburgh and against the Latinx community at a Walmart in El Paso, Texas. We all must come together to comprehensively develop new approaches to keep our communities safe. While the financing of domestic terror organizations is much smaller than international terrorism, with organizations using inexpensive methods, cutting off their resources should nevertheless be a top priority. Domestic extremists such as white supremacists may use funding for organizational operations, attacks, or for more indirect threats, such as propaganda, that can motivate others to commit acts of violence. Domestic extremists typically fund their operations through a range of measures, including self-funding and using their own finances, a variety of criminal activities, bartering and other in-kind relationships, and other methods that they apply, such as direct contributions from other individuals, crowdfunding, advertisements, and the proceed of merchandise sales, and lastly, anonymized transfers and transactions such as cryptocurrency. We urge companies to independently act to prevent extremists from using their services to bring harm to our communities. Research supported by Congress can help companies determine the best way to address today's challenge. Some of the promising practices for the financial industry include crafting more effective terms of service, improving reporting mechanisms, maximizing transparency, ensuring appropriate training for trust and safety teams, collaborating across industry, including with civil society, and putting appropriate limitations on actions to protect civil liberties and prevent discrimination. We look to you in this committee to use your authority to support cutting off financial flows to mitigate extremist threats. We ask you to support research on the threat of domestic terrorist financing and what works to counter it. The FBI and the Department of Justice should prioritize their efforts and transparently share their view of what the domestic threat picture is, including financing and terrorism generally. There are a range of steps Congress can take to help counter domestic terrorism threats, some of which are ready for your immediate action. First and foremost, we implore you to use every opportunity to speak out loudly against all forms of hate. Second, we need the executive branch to be held to a higher standard of transparency on domestic terrorism issues and further examine options under current law, such as whether overseas white supremacist groups meet the criteria to be designated as foreign terrorist organizations or FTOs. Third, we urge Congress to immediately pass the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, pass the Jabbar Hire No Hate Act, and increase funding for the Nonprofit Security Grant Program and the DHS Office of Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention. And finally, in light of the lack of prosecutable domestic terrorism charge, Congress should examine whether a rights-protecting domestic criminal charge is in fact necessary. Government cannot address today's threats alone, and we need whole-of-society approaches to today's challenges. And financial services firms, technology companies, and other members of the private sector should be urged to improve how they can address harmful content on their platform. Thank you for this opportunity to present before you today.
Thank you, Ms. Miller. You are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Cleaver, Ranking Member Hill, Chairman Waters, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Rena Miller, and I'm a specialist in financial economics at Congressional Research Service. Today I'll discuss the regulatory tools on which our counterterrorism financing system relies, as well as ways in which these existing tools are challenged to address domestic terrorism. I'll also touch upon changing technologies and new proposals. I would note that CRS is nonpartisan and does not advocate for any particular policies or proposals. The existing U.S. regulatory regime to combat terrorism financing was not set up with the challenges of today's domestic terrorism in mind. The existing regime draws heavily upon the Bank Secrecy Act of 1970, the BSA, and the USA Patriot Act passed in the wake of 9/11. Their key requirements include record keeping and reporting for financial institutions, which I'll call banks, and due diligence on customers opening accounts, as well as on terrorism designations. These requirements can be powerful tools to track foreign terrorists, but they may be less relevant for flagging a potential domestic terror attack in advance, particularly for small-scale attacks that may not require large sums of money, such as those involving retail firearms or a rented car. Another pillar of our counterterrorism financing regime, or CFT regime, has been the designations of foreign terrorist organizations and the freezing of their assets. But such designations apply only to the financing of terrorists abroad, not to domestic groups. This may reflect First Amendment concerns. Although there is very little public information, domestic terrorists appear to require relatively limited funds to finance their operations, may rely on crowdfunding, and may be harder for banks to screen, assuming they use banks, absent designations or other public information. In sum, although the U.S. may have potent regulatory tools against international terrorism, these may be harder to leverage against domestic terrorism. Current threats from domestic terrorism underscore these challenges. In recent testimony, FBI Director Wray noted that lone offenders represent the dominant trend for lethal domestic terrorists, and that frequently they act without a clear group affiliation or guidance, making them challenging to identify, investigate, and disrupt. Bank Secrecy Act reports can provide valuable information to law enforcement, particularly following such attacks, even if their usefulness in flagging potential attacks is still debated. There is little in the way of public systematic studies of domestic terrorism financing. The Anti-Defamation League's study provides one of the few relevant public sources. Their study found that such groups tend to be poorly funded, decentralized, to be early adopters of new technology, and to often rely on crowdfunding and cryptocurrencies. Evolving technology and use of new data sets may potentially be employed to address these challenges. As such, cross-cutting issues that span different areas of congressional oversight may become more important. For example, access to data provided on social media sites and payment platforms may become relevant. Some argue that expanding the data sources examined, such as through automated text analysis of social media, or increasing the interoperability of systems that examine the data, such as between government agencies, can help in identifying domestic terrorists. Others, however, oppose an expansion of monitoring or surveillance for domestic groups, citing constitutional issues. An approach Congress may choose to pursue is an interdisciplinary, interagency study to examine the use of new technologies in both the spread and financing of domestic terrorism. Such a study may also be used to survey what data sets exist, who has access to that data, and the potential uses of such data. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. McCord, you are recognized now for 5 minutes to give us an oral presentation of your testimony.
Chairman Cleaver, Ranking Member Hill, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify about some of the challenges of investigating the financing of domestic terrorism and extremism. There are marked differences between the tools available to investigate the financing of domestic terrorism and those available to investigate international terrorism. This is because the First Amendment protects the freedom of speech and peaceful assembly of U.S. persons and organizations while providing no such protections for foreign persons and organizations. Thus, U.S. law provides for the designation of foreign terrorist organizations like ISIS and al-Qaeda, even if those same organizations might engage in some non-terrorist activity that would be protected by the First Amendment if they were based here in the United States. A foreign terrorist, or FTO designation, allows the United States to enforce criminal statutes that prohibit providing material support or resources to designated FTOs. The material support statute provides a basis for law enforcement and the intelligence community to open investigations on suspicion that a person or entity may be financing a foreign terrorist organization, regardless of the purpose of the financing. In other words, even if a person wants to fund only the quote-unquote humanitarian operations of an FTO, it is prohibited. The material support statute therefore drives U.S. financial services providers to implement sophisticated risk management protocols for detecting potential misuse of their services for foreign terrorist financing. By contrast, because of the rights protected by the First Amendment, there is no comparable designation scheme for domestic extremist organizations. Hateful speech, even if abhorrent to the majority of the population, is protected by the First Amendment, as is assembling with others who share the same hateful views. Unless an organization engages solely in unprotected activity, such as committing crimes of violence, any designation of an organization as a terrorist organization, a U.S. organization, would likely run afoul of the First Amendment. Thus, law enforcement cannot open an investigation merely based on suspicion that someone is providing financing to a U.S.-based extremist group. Moreover, the FBI is prohibited by its own internal rules from opening investigations based purely on First Amendment activity. To use investigative tools like undercover and sting operations, sometimes criticized as overly aggressive but important in any crime prevention program, the FBI must have reason to believe that a crime is being or may be committed. For the reasons just discussed, providing material support for a designated terrorist organization is not an available option for opening an investigation into the financing of domestic extremist organizations. But there's another gap in our criminal laws that impacts terrorism investigations. Currently, there is no federal law prohibiting what is commonly thought of as domestic terrorism when committed with a firearm, knife, vehicle, all of which have been used in recent domestic terrorist attacks in the U.S., when that crime is not connected to a foreign terrorist organization or committed against a U.S. official or U.S. government property. Likewise, there's no federal criminal terrorism prohibition on stockpiling firearms with the intent to commit a mass attack to further what we think of as domestic ideologies like white supremacy, as long as it's unconnected to foreign terrorist organization. This gap has several important implications. First, it fails to accord moral equivalency to terrorist acts regardless of the ideology motivating them. This leads to a double standard that perpetuates the misconception that all terrorism is Islamist extremist terrorism, even when the lethality of domestic terrorism in the homeland exceeds that of international terrorism. Second, it results in inaccurate and inadequate data about incidents of domestic terrorism that could be used to develop measures to counter the threat. Third, and most salient for today's hearing, it fails to integrate domestic terrorism investigations into the U.S. counterterrorism program, which is based on prevention of terrorist acts rather than prosecutions after the fact. Filling the gap in our terrorism statutes, as explained more fully in the paper I provided as part of my written testimony, when coupled with appropriate oversight to ensure that resources are being used to combat the most significant threats and not to infringe First Amendment rights, would provide more flexibility for law enforcement to open investigations into those who may be acquiring or providing resources, financial or otherwise, for potential terrorist attacks. Thank you again for the opportunity to address the subcommittee.
Thank you, Ms. McCord. Thank all of you for your testimony. I recognize myself now for 5 minutes. And what I'd like to do is just follow up with you, Ms. McCord, because you raised an issue that we've tried to address. In August, right after the El Paso murders, I sent a letter to Treasury Secretary Mnuchin and to the Secretary of State and to the Attorney General, William Barr, asking that the Department of the Treasury and Department of State designate the El Paso shooter as a specially designated global terrorist, consistent with Executive Order 13224, and to develop a list of other potential white nationalist individuals or organizations in an attempt to prevent future attacks. And what we have now, most of the things that we've concentrated on domestically are not domestic. We're still responding to 9/11. So are we moving in the right direction? The FBI still recognizes, you mentioned it, the paramount threats based on outside international bad actors. What can we do? I mean, you raised the issue, but do you have any specific recommendations for us?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have recommended in writing and public speaking that I've done and in consultations with Republicans and Democrats in both the Senate and the House of Representatives have suggested consideration of a domestic terrorism statute. Now, I say domestic terrorism, but really I think the distinctions between domestic and international terrorism have pretty much fallen by the wayside for the reasons you just indicated. We've seen domestic terrorist attacks here where the attacker is referencing the Christchurch, New Zealand shooter, for example, people in Netherlands and Western Europe, Southeast Asia, et cetera. They all are referring to each other. And we know that there are white nationalist and white supremacist extremist groups operating and advocating violence in other countries. So in addition to potentially creating a domestic terrorism statute, and by that, I don't mean designation of domestic organizations as terrorist organizations, because I do think that presents very fraught First Amendment problems, as I indicated in my oral statement. But criminalizing the actual commission of violent acts when done with the intent to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, or influence the policy of government through intimidation or coercion, which is the current definition of terrorism in the U.S. Criminal Code. That would drive more resources toward prevention and investigations using proactive techniques like undercover operations, sting operations, et cetera. It would need to be accompanied by oversight, reporting to Congress and to the public to ensure that those resources are not misused. I think also worth considering, and particularly pertinent to your question, is whether there are foreign terrorist or foreign organizations that are white supremacist, white nationalist organizations engaging in terrorism that would meet the criteria for designation as a foreign terrorist organization. They just have to be foreign, they have to engage in terrorist acts, or have the capability and intent to engage in terrorist acts and present a threat to U.S. nationals or the homeland. With a designation of a foreign terrorist organization for a white nationalist group, that group would become poison, just like Al-Qaeda and ISIS.
Thank you very, very much. Ms. Brooks, Mr. Selim, I don't have a lot of time left, but the whole social media issue is chilling. And on April 9th, this is amazing, we had a hearing on hate crimes, and we had testimony from representatives from Google, which owns YouTube. And it was reported that YouTube was forced to turn off comments sections of its live stream less than an hour into our hearing because it was flooded with hate speech and racist comments. The First Amendment issue is something we all in this country respect, But when human life hangs in the balance, what is the right balance to respect civil liberties, but at the same time preserve life?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for that question. So ADL believes very firmly in protecting the right of free speech of any person or any group in the U.S., irrespective of how abhorrent those beliefs can be. But there is indeed a line which we have seen crossed in recent years where hate speech leads to hate violence and violent extremism in the U.S., as the other panelists here have documented extensively in their testimonies. Some of the measures that YouTube in particular and other social media companies are starting to employ are a step in the right direction, but it's our belief that more needs to be done.
I'm going to return to this if we have second rounds of questions. Right now, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Arkansas, the ranking member, Mr. Hill.
Thank you, Chairman. Thanks again for this hearing. Ms. McCord, just following up on that theme, we obviously have a statute against hate crimes in the United States. Are you, and it includes planning one in addition to committing one, is that a place where you would go to work on this definition of domestic terror effectively? Tell me the distinctions there between committing a hate crime, which is against federal law, and the more complex conspiracy aspect of domestic terrorism.
Certainly. I think I look at this as a Venn diagram. So there are certainly many cases in which a crime that would qualify under the definition in the federal criminal code as domestic terrorism might also be a hate crime. For example, the Pittsburgh synagogue shooter at the Tree of Life. He is now charged with multiple federal hate crimes. I would say that his crime also very well qualifies as domestic terrorism under the U.S. criminal code. And that is, again, a crime of violence that violates state or criminal law, and that is done to intimidate or coerce a civilian population or influence the policy of government through intimidation or coercion. So I do think, and I know many people have said, more rigorous enforcement of our hate crime statutes and investigations predicated on those statutes might be a gap filler. And I do think it would be helpful, and more resources should be put toward that. But there are things that would not fall into the center of that Venn diagram. Anarchist violence, sovereign citizen violence, violence that's not based on race, religion, or one of the other protected categories of hate crimes would fall outside of that. And so it's not a perfect fit. It's also not a perfect fit just as a practical matter because the investigators, at least at the FBI, which is the ones I'm the most experienced with given my career at the Department of Justice, those that are in the counterterrorism branch are specialists in terrorism, and they're specialists in the types of investigative techniques used to ferret out and prevent terrorist acts. The investigators, wonderful investigators in the hate crimes branch, are within the criminal division focused, and their own assistant director, I believe, has testified to this effect, focused on justice after the fact. So I understand that those two branches now have a joint task force and are working more together, and I applaud that, and I think it's a great idea, but there are still some gaps that remain.
Thank you. Mr. Selim, you want to add to that, please?
I would only add to the last point that Ms. McCord made that this new joint fusion cell at the FBI, ADL has worked closely with both sides, both the counterterrorism division and the criminal side, which investigates hate crimes. We've been a firm supporter of increased resources for federal government enforcement of hate crimes laws, as well as that would be devoted to the FBI and the Department of Justice's ability to collect information and data related to hate crimes and bias-based crimes. There's a lot more that we believe, as part of the gaps that Ms. McCord alluded to, that DOJ and FBI can be doing to incentivize state and local municipalities for increased reporting on hate crimes. The joint fusion cell that they've established is a step in the right direction. More resources and data needs to be collected to help fill those gaps.
Thank you. Ms. Brooks, are there any states that have a domestic terrorism statute in the United States? We do have hate crime, state hate crime laws, I guess.
That is correct. I agree with Ms. McCord and Mr. Selim. There is that nexus, but it doesn't always kind of fit together. If we were to provide consistent protections around hate crimes and the investigation of hate crimes, then we could make headway. I do note that the Department of Homeland Security did disband a group of intelligence analysts who focused on domestic terrorism. So when we take steps back in that way, I think we lose ground.
Okay, thank you for that. Mr. Chairman, you know, we frequently in Congress put things into buckets, and sometimes people attempt to introduce bills in their committee. They serve on the Committee of Jurisdiction when the problem really should be solved elsewhere in another committee occasionally. What's good about this, I think, is the illicit finance aspect of it and calling attention to it, so I commend the hearing. But I am concerned that we got to go to first principles. So before we go around and try to get FinCEN involved in something that there probably is not the right place for it, we ought to make sure that we look at this legal basis to deal with the First Amendment, deal with the constitutionality, deal with the definitional issues, because, you know, it's really a domestic issue. We need domestic laws that deal with it. So I would hope Homeland Security, you know, and the FBI would make recommendations in this so that we can get first principles right before we deal with some of these derivative potential issues. But this has been very helpful, and I look forward to the continued discussion. Yield back.
Thank you. I am on Homeland Security, and I do think we probably ought to try to do something jointly. I'd like to recognize now the chair of the full committee, Ms. Waters, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so very much, Chairman Cleaver. This is a very important hearing, and President Trump has consistently downplayed the threat of domestic terrorism, especially the violence from the right-wing extremists among his supporters. The Trump administration has undermined the FBI and other law enforcement agencies by cutting budgets, eliminating staffers, and terminating programs to counter radicalization. His administration, I believe, is harming the government's ability to respond to the growing threats from domestic terrorism. I would like to know what the panel thinks about this president's denial that there is a threat from right-wing extremists, and how his thinking and his actions affected the federal government's efforts to fight domestic terrorism. Let me just start with asking a response to this by, one moment, Ms. Brooks, who is Chief Workplace Transformation Officer for the Southern Poverty Law Center. Would you respond to?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much. Certainly, President Trump's acceptance and encouragement of this rhetoric around hate and the whole notion of a white genocide, these ideas are, he picks them up and carries them into the public square. The Southern Poverty Law Center would say that one of the biggest drivers in the increase in hate and hate activity is this whole notion of shifting demographics. It plays into the false notion and the false narrative that there's a white genocide afoot. Unfortunately, President Trump, because that's a large amount of his base, he doesn't counter that narrative. The truth of the matter is that when he says that there are fine people, when he says that there's no threat, there's no real threat, you know, they're troubled people or troubled individuals, he's rejecting the facts, the research that shows that there's been an increase in these hate attacks, not only domestically, but internationally as well. We also know it's not helpful to have senior advisors within your administration that are seen as advancing a white nationalist agenda.
Are you referring to Mr. Miller?
I'm referring, yes. As you know, the Southern Poverty Law Center released a number of emails between Mr. Miller and Breitbart News, which you know, was known as the alt-right, the platform for the alt-right. I would remind us that within this administration, he started out with Steve Bannon, who is also an avowed white nationalist. So these kinds of relationships make it hard for, I think, for the president to take one stand or the other. You cannot hold people close to you and then take a stand against their very actions. So I would agree with you. It's problematic. It's troublesome. We look to the Congress and the rest of our leaders to hold the administration to account.
Thank you. Mr. Selim, do you agree with that?
Chairwoman Waters, thank you for that question, and thank you
Yes.
for raising these issues. I'd like to offer a few concrete facts and statistics that I think can help speak to address this issue. Over the course of the past decade, between calendar year 2009 and 2018, domestic extremists of all kinds killed nearly 430 people across the United States. Of those deaths, 73% were at the hands of right-wing extremists such as white supremacists, sovereign citizens, and militia adherents, as a number of the members of this committee alluded to. In 2018, there were nearly 50 deaths, which was the fourth deadliest year on record for domestic extremist-related killings since 1970. Ma'am, the conclusion of these statistics is that when it comes to white supremacist and white nationalist violence that results in the loss of life in the United States, it's impossible to blame one specific person. There are a range of different factors that can be attributed to the loss of American lives, but I would say that it's the responsibility and it is incumbent on leaders at all levels, federal, state, and local, to stand up and forcefully speak out against bigotry and intolerance of all forms.
Do you attribute to the president a lack of leadership in this area?
I would say that any opportunity an elected or appointed official has the opportunity to condemn bigotry and intolerance, they should do so.
I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Waters. I appreciate very much the Houston Texans being beaten soundly by the Chiefs on this past Sunday. And so now I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member, for this hearing. I must say I'm disappointed that we are taking political shots at our president when the threat of domestic terrorism is real, and what we're doing is reducing the true impact, I believe, of this hearing today. So I'm sorry that we've gotten down that road. With that being said, I'm sure you all remember just a few years ago the Congressional baseball team, of which I was a member and one of 6 that was wounded, was targeted by a left-wing deranged shooter who was specifically targeting the Republican team because of his political beliefs. Also, Fort Hood is in my district, which you're familiar with some of the instances we've had at Fort Hood. So this whole thing is real personal with me. I may see it different than others. And with that being said, we as Americans must always be able to speak about our differences and carry unwavering beliefs without resorting to violence. So I want to thank our witnesses for coming here before us today to share your expertise so that we can all ensure that such horrible incidents which we talk about will never happen again. So many of you have referenced in your testimonies that these attacks often do not require many resources to carry out. As we debate various proposals to try to stop these attacks before they occur, we need to take into account the constitutional and privacy concerns that would come if there was increased data collection by our government or financial institutions. We as lawmakers must debate these issues in full transparency in front of the American people as we like to strike the correct balance. So make no mistake, domestic terrorism is horrible in all of its forms. And I am not calling for inaction, but we must make sure we understand that all repercussions before passing new laws. So, Ms. McCord, my question to you would be, I would like to get your thoughts on what you believe is the appropriate balance between free speech, privacy, and security.
Thank you, Congressman. The Supreme Court's been very clear that violence and incitement to imminent violence is not protected by the First Amendment. And so I think that's a good place to start when we talk about drawing the lines. And I mentioned earlier in today's testimony that I have advocated for Congress to study whether a terrorism offense should be created that applies to all terrorism that occurs here in the United States, regardless of its ideology. And it would apply to crimes of violence that are criminal under federal or state law. So we're talking about murder, kidnapping, assault with aggravated assault, assault with a dangerous weapon, those types of serious crimes, when done with the intention to intimidate or coerce a civilian population or influence the policy of government through intimidation or coercion. These are the acts that are being then investigated. It's not First Amendment protected activity that would be being investigated. And so I think that draws that line. Now, to get to the latter part of your question about how do we ensure privacy, as I've alluded to, and also just civil rights and civil liberties, as I've alluded to before, I think it's important, particularly when we're talking about investigations here in the homeland of U.S. persons and U.S. entities, that there be rigorous oversight to ensure that if there were a new terrorism statute applicable to terrorism here at home, again, it would be regardless of ideology. It could be Islamist extremist terrorism, white nationalist extremism, animal rights extremism, that there is reporting of the investigations opened by category on a sort of a yearly basis so that Congress and the American people can ensure that these tools are not being misused by law enforcement to go after individuals whose views they disagree with.
Okay. Ms. Miller, on page 4 of your testimony, you state that white supremacist groups tend to be early adapters of new technologies to finance their activities. So do you think the government procurement process operates at a pace that hamstrings our agencies from monitoring and combating these new funding streams as they come to market?
Congressman, thank you for that question. I'm an expert in financial regulation, but not in government procurement. But we do have experts at CRS who follow government procurement issues. So if you would like me to follow up on that, we could get a written answer back to you.
You would, I'd appreciate that. Director Maples, in your testimony, you say the New Jersey Suspicious Activity Reporting System collects and analyzes over 1,000 SARs per year. While this number seems manageable for your team, FinCEN collectively receives well over 1 million SARs every year. With such a high volume of suspicious activity being reported, it seems like finding the credible threats would be obscured amongst all the other data. So real quick, how can we better tailor our SAR regime to expose legitimate threats?
So first of all, New Jersey is unique in that my agency coordinates it, and that goes to the federal e-guardian system, as I mentioned in my comments, but it goes down to the local level. So that, I believe, can be replicated nationally and supported. We have a smaller number because we're not dealing with the entire nation, we're dealing with New Jersey. But the model we have as far as integrated in one central location versus multiple fusion centers, multiple areas, just the federal side, we think our model is effective, and if that can be replicated, we'd be happy to partner and push that narrative out there.
Okay, thank you. I yield my time back.
Thank you. The gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Gottmer, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Maples, I've proposed bipartisan legislation called the FASTER Act to help law enforcement freeze the assets of ISIS-inspired lone wolf terrorists and other extremists on our soil, to prevent these funds from being used to carry out another attack by friends, family, or unknown accomplices operating in a small cell. It also calls for a national homegrown terrorism incident clearinghouse for law enforcement to collect and share information on incidents to help investigate and thwart future attacks. Director, given your experience in New Jersey, do you believe that establishing a national clearinghouse for incidents of homegrown and domestic terrorism would help federal, state, and local governments and the private sector collect, share, and mine data to help identify patterns?
Thank you, Congressman, and I also want to thank you for your comments at the beginning and your partnership and leadership in this area. It's been vital to our efforts in New Jersey.
Thank you, sir.
I do think so. I think, as I just mentioned to the gentleman from Texas, we do think we have a great model, and the more we can do a clearinghouse and remove stovepipes and eliminate those threads that may not be being connected amongst federal, state, local entities, the better and safer we'll be. Obviously mindful within the rights of the citizenry and our visitors here, but we want to make sure that we connect those dots, and in doing something like a clearinghouse is definitely an effective way to do that.
Thank you. In recent years, your office has determined that homegrown violent extremists inspired by foreign terrorist organizations such as ISIS and Al-Qaeda remain the highest threat to New Jersey. In 2017, our state's one-of-a-kind suspicious activity reporting, as we were just talking about, SAR program, helped lead to the arrest of a New Jersey man planning to help build and detonate a pressure cooker bomb in New York on behalf of ISIS. How does financial information, do you think, such as suspicious wire transfers or large cash transactions, play a part in NJ's SARS program, and are there gaps when it comes to gathering this information that could help lead to an arrest or prevent a potential terrorist attack?
So one, it is effective. It's a fantastic case example, I think, of this happening and working in real time. As far as the financial pieces go, we do get reports on those, and as the gentleman from Texas also mentioned, there is a large variety of financial suspicious activity reports throughout the country and the world. I think we can better tie into those and make clearer articulations as why those are suspicious activities, and that can help our state system in making sure that we're getting that out there to local financial institutions, but then also our communities. That's that connection point that may help us head off another incident.
Speaking of new trends and threats, from 2013 to 2017, terrorists carried out 25 known vehicle ramming attacks in North America and Western Europe, resulting in 156 fatalities and 790 injuries. This includes the Halloween 2017 terrorist attack in Lower Manhattan, which killed 8 people, including my constituent Darren Drake of New Milford, New Jersey. Since that tragic day, I've worked closely with the Drake family to stop terror truck attacks and recently reintroduced the bipartisan Darren Drake Act, H.R. 4942, with Congressman Fitzpatrick to ensure rental companies report suspicious behavior at every point of sale. Director, do we see domestic and homegrown terrorists increasingly resort to terror trucks attacks in public space, and how can we stay ahead of this particular threat?
It's a fantastic point, and yes, we do see a direct nexus. We're starting to see domestic groups, and I would also mention, Mr. Selim, in the work of the ADL. We partner with the ADL and multiple groups throughout the country, FBI, et cetera, in determining the nexus. We see a clear nexus of domestic terrorism groups starting to look towards foreign terrorism organizations for methodologies, TTPs, tactics, and practices, and what we're trying to observe. Mass gathering attacks, vehicle-borne attacks, using knives. They're seeing that those are effective, and you're starting to see an online presence in some other areas that we know of that they're talking about using those tactics here in America.
Thank you. Mr. Selim, I want to recognize the ADL for years of sounding the alarm on the threat of violent anti-Semitism and attacks on religious groups. We recently experienced, as you know, the horrific act of domestic terrorism targeting the Jewish community in Jersey City. We know the assailants had been planning for months, acquired supplies, and practiced at a firing range in the days before the shooting. Do you believe that there was any information that could have tipped off law enforcement that the couple was planning an attack? How can we find this sort of information out going forward?
Congressman, thank you for that question, and thank you for acknowledging both the award and the close cooperation between ADL and the New Jersey Homeland Security. The way that radicalization and recruitment and mobilization, like we saw play out in Jersey City, has been playing out in recent years, has continued to evolve. ADL believes that there can be more done to prevent and intervene in the cycle of radicalization and recruitment. Fundamentally, better data drives better policy and better security. So the ability for federal, state, local, and non-governmental entities to collect information, to get better reporting on suspicious activity and a range of other factors can lead to more comprehensive security procedures. And also, it's our belief that we need a comprehensive set of solutions that include mental health, social service, education providers, not limited solely to law enforcement, but in partnership and in concert with law enforcement prevention services.
Thank you. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a unanimous consent request. Ms. Waters?
Thank you very much. Unanimous consent request to enter into the record a report compiled by the Southern Poverty Law Center on Stephen Miller's affinity for white nationalism revealed in leaked emails.
Without objections?
Thank you.
The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Riggleman, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all of you for being here. And before I start my questions, my background was foreign terrorism, kinetically and non-kinetically, so for a long time. So have some questions on that, but also this hits close to my heart. Specifically, thank you, Representative Williams, for what you said today. Anytime you see political violence like that is abhorrent, and the reason I can talk to that also is in my district, that's where Charlottesville is. So, August 12, 2017 was an awful day for my district and what happened there. And for me, as far as white supremacists are concerned, I really wish they would just go back to their cave. And that's really pretty blunt in what I can say about that, specifically because I got the chance to see ethnic cleansing for real and ethnic violence during Operation Allied Force when I was on the Romanian-Serbian border. We were trying to protect the Kosovars from ethnic cleansing there. So this is something that it gets me angry, and I think you see a lot of that here, on our panel today. Some of the things, we're the National Security Subcommittee. in financial services. And I, you know, talking about the Ranking Member Hill's comments about other things that could be done first, I actually have some specific questions about how we can thwart domestic terrorism and homegrown violent extremist attacks, but it's actually how we can help. And I know that's scary. We're Congress and we're here to help, but I do want to ask these questions, you know, as we go forward and how we can help. And I had some incredible questions here, but listening to, and Mr. Maples talking about you and also the incredible work that you're doing in New Jersey, right? And really, Josh, great job. I think he already left. Where can we go? And I'm going to have a lot of questions here. When you're talking about gaps and enforcement, and I'm going to talk illicit finance with Ms. McCord also, and Mr. Selim and Ms. Brooks. But as far as gaps, when you're talking steganography, when you're talking all the things you're doing with, you know, cryptocurrency utilization, gaming command and control, social media radicalization, and the TTP similarities, or, you know, tactics, techniques, and procedure similarities between domestic terrorists and foreign terrorist organizations, which I really would love to have a talk with you about that one day. But also social network analysis and pattern analysis. When you're talking about what you're doing for that specifically, where are the gaps that you're seeing, even in fusion center types of activities, when you're looking at targeting, when you're looking at intelligence analysis? Is there something that Congress could be doing better with resources or information sharing, you know, title authority information sharing? Where do you see those roadblocks, and or something specifically we can do, specifically on the Financial Services Committee, where we can help you in trying to get through those obstructions?
Thank you, Congressman. Ms. McCord, I think hit it exactly on the head regarding the ties with the financing aspect of it. When financial systems are used to fund these terrorist activities, right now, largely, certainly by federal statute, they're seen as criminal, and they're independent of the acts, potentially. I think a tie between those, when you have, whether it be material support, whatever you want to call that side, bridging that gap. And when you've used illicit funding streams, all the ones that we've listed, everyone up on stage, and the schemes that are used there, and it ends up resulting in a violent act, or in a way that we can prevent that violent act from occurring when we find out about a financial tie, it should be treated as terrorism, we believe. So I think from that perspective, the support, and I think what every speaker has talked about, in getting your support on that side would be huge for us.
And that's what I want to do. And Ms. McCord, I mean, and you can go back to Mr. Maples too. I want to ask this question because there's experts up here, and everybody might have something to say on this. Do you see a rise in cryptocurrency utilization over, say, fiat currency? Are you seeing something, you know, based on, say, goodness, the way to transfer money? And I did some steganography, right? Are you seeing a rise in cryptocurrency utilization as something that we don't have the place to resource, or do we need to resource that, or do you see that that's a huge limiting factor or a limfac for law enforcement right now?
So I don't have good data on to the extent to which domestic extremists are using cryptocurrency. It's not my area of expertise. I think it is something that definitely needs study. If I could answer your question about another gap very quickly, because I know time is short, is I also think we need more government-to-government sharing of information. As we've discussed, right, this is not just a domestic problem. And NCTC, for example, historically has shared only sort of international terrorism information and not this type of information, and that could help not only ferret out the tactics and plans and plotting, but also financing.
A loaded question for NCTC, because I've worked with them also. Do you see that they don't have the resources for domestic terrorism and information sharing, or do you actually see government gaps or actually authority issues with sharing that information across law enforcement agencies?
So I know that they've recently, through their lawyers, done their own sort of review of their authorities and have concluded that they can move into this space. I haven't done my own separate analysis of that, and I believe that the director late last year announced that they were going to be trying to develop protocols for sharing more information with respect to threats other than your typical foreign terrorist organization threats. I can't answer the resource question. You would need to ask that of NCTC directly, but I think it's a very good development if we start sharing more information, government to government, and then within government, federal down to state to local, on domestic threats. I was down in southern New Mexico last spring and meeting with local officials there about issues happening on the border where completely unlawful private militias were unlawfully detaining migrants at the border, and I was talking to their local sheriffs, police departments, et cetera, and they said, I get a briefing every day about what's happening in Yemen, but I don't know what's happening 2 miles away at the border.
And thank you, my time's up. I want to help all of you all with those stovepipes. I love breaking stovepipes apart and crushing them, so thank you very much, and I yield my time.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from Virginia, Ms. Wexton, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing before us today and for all the great work that you're doing in this area. As most of you have already pointed out, domestic terrorists have been responsible for more murders in the United States than have international terrorists in recent years. The FBI released a report in November that looked at lone wolf or lone offender terror attacks from 1972 to 2015 and found that firearms were by far the most common weapon used in such attacks, followed by explosives. Nearly 70% of the firearms used in those attacks were legally purchased. Now, many of you brought up the shootings in El Paso, where the shooter purchased an assault weapon online from Romania and thousands of rounds of ammunition from Russia, which he was able to pick up at a local gun store. The New York Times did some reporting on the financing of these attacks and found that in 8 of the last 13 mass shootings in which more than 10 people were murdered, the murderers used in most cases, and in most cases relied upon credit cards in order to amass their arsenals. The attacker in Las Vegas spent nearly $95,000 on firearms in just the year leading up to the attack, almost exclusively with credit cards. The Pulse nightclub shooter opened 6 new credit card accounts over 8 months and spent over $26,000 on firearms and ammunition in the 12 days prior to the shooting. Mr. Selim and whoever else can answer this on the panel, can law enforcement generally and Treasury and FinCEN specifically do more to detect and disrupt these types of attacks?
Ma'am, thank you for your question. And it's a critical issue that I think goes back to a number of issues that the panelists here have brought up, specifically related to law enforcement, information sharing, and tips and tools between private industry and financial institutions. To specifically answer your question, yes, we believe more can be done. The illustrations that you just described with Las Vegas, El Paso, and others, there can be more information sharing, gap analysis. There can be more transparency reporting, as well as training for trust and safety teams at financial institutions that may see abnormalities in purchases of firearms or bulk purchases of ammunition, et cetera. So we think that there are a number of steps, which I've outlined in my written testimony, which can be taken to strengthen the relationship to prevent, God forbid, another type of attack like the ones you just described.
Does anyone else wish to chime in on that or opine about what can be done?
I would add that the banking institutions, I would hope that they would also kind of monitor large purchases like that. That was fascinating the way you laid out. It was $95,000, $96,000, I believe you said. That should set off some check, some alarm. It's very interesting.
So speaking of the data that would need to be collected and the parties that would need to be involved in such reporting, it's not exclusively the banks, although they're the ones who are the holders of those credit cards. That would also require buy-in and sharing of data from the retailers. Ms. Miller, are you aware of any gaps that exist in that reporting from the retailer side of things?
Well, let me just say, stepping back a moment, the issue has received a lot of attention in the press, in Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and some Washington Post reports about the role of credit cards in financing some of these mass shootings. In terms of the data and standards that apply, there are a voluntary standard within the credit card industry called the PCCI standards. And it's not currently clear, at least to me, whether and to what degree financial institutions have access to the types of data that retail and merchants obtain. So I think that question certainly remains.
So retailers don't necessarily automatically disclose these purchases to banks in a way that they would be able to gather that information and report it were they required to do so.
My understanding is that financial institutions that provide credit cards to merchants, I believe that they say they don't, as a normal course of business, get that information. I think the question would probably go to the payment card industry for more detail.
Thank you. Now, given the sophistication of AI and a lot of the existing programs that we already have in place to combat money laundering and other illicit financial activity, it's clear to me that we can do more using financial intelligence to intervene in these kinds of attacks and hopefully be proactive and stop them from happening before they take place. Thank you. With that, I yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Rose, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Cleaver, and thanks to the panel for being here today to discuss this important issue of homegrown radicalization and terrorism finance. To tackle domestic terrorism more effectively, many experts say the United States needs increased cooperation and collaboration among all law enforcement, the Department of Homeland Security, and other agencies. Mr. Maples, how would you describe information sharing between government agencies today?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I can only speak for New Jersey and my optic in New Jersey, but I can tell you that our information sharing is unique in New Jersey in that we are directly tied and integrated from federal, state, and local levels. We're proud of that in New Jersey, and we do believe it's working effectively. One area, and it gets to a couple of the questions that have come about, is in technology behind it, and some of the sharing that we're hearing about from a financial sector. I think we can do better at that. There's a lot of tools, there's a lot of resources available at the federal side. I know I mentioned I worked in charge of cybersecurity in New Jersey. For example, JP Morgan spends about $775 million a year on cybersecurity. I think there can be better ties into some of those networks, resources, and tools, and that will promote information sharing in a way that hasn't been done before, specifically to finance, and I think that can be more effective.
Are there barriers that need to be addressed that you're aware of?
Well, right now, I don't know that there's a direct tie into those financing pieces. It's really tied around physical security, critical infrastructure security, but on the physical side. And there is a gap there that I think we can address together, and it's really been highlighted, I think, by the panelists. And that can be an area where we would see an increase in threat prevention and threat detection.
Are there currently instances where private entities such as banks proactively share information in your experience?
There are, and I don't want to speak on behalf of the FBI, but they do have a program that's helping with that. In the state of New Jersey, we're working towards that, and we have a great infrastructure program that my agency runs that there are mandatory tie-ins, but again, it's largely been based in the physical threat realm up until this point. And what we're seeing with finances, it's not just the technology, but also the money transfers, et cetera. And I think that that's an area where we can expand, but we're going to need a tighter definition of that, I think, from the federal side to get the funding tied to that, and additional funding.
One of the bills before us today is H.R. 5132, which would require FinCEN to issue an advisory about how homegrown violent extremists and other domestic terrorists obtain firearms. I have some very serious concerns about this bill. First, the bill requires FinCEN to define various terms, including firearm accessory, homegrown violent extremist, lone wolf, and lone actor. Ms. McCord, have these terms already been defined by other agencies such as the FBI, DOJ, DHS, or others? And what would the benefit of FinCEN developing its own definitions be in your estimation?
So some of those terms are defined in current criminal statutes like firearms and accessories. Others are terms of art used by FBI and DOJ for their own internal purposes. I'd have to look at each term to see whether there were already definitions in the code. I think it's a matter of avoiding confusion when there are already pre-existing definitions in the U.S. code for a term. That's probably the one you want to turn to when you're looking at new legislation. But I do think there is certainly value to collecting information related to firearms purchases and firearms accessory purchases. Taking my experience prosecuting international terrorism for several years, oftentimes when we were talking about terrorist acts occurring here in the United States, these involved acquiring firearms for use in those attacks, and many operations that the FBI undertook, investigative undercover operations, involved engaging online in an undercover capacity with individuals who were seeking to acquire firearms in particular for use in terrorist attacks.
Thank you. Just want to say, as I kind of reiterating my concern about 5132 and coming from a background with the private banking industry, financial institutions, I'm deeply concerned that we continue to call on private sector players to, at their expense, which of course ultimately is at the consumer's expense, provide information and conduct law enforcement activity in gathering information without really any consideration for the cost that it imposes on those institutions. That adds to my concern. And thank you. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from California, Mr. Vargas, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member, for bringing this forward. I think it's very important to talk about and try to find solutions. I also want to appreciate what Mr. Riggleman said, the issue of ethnic cleansing, because we do see in other societies and other countries what happens when you have extremism that runs afoul. For example, we were very fortunate, my family, in being able to adopt a Muslim family from Kosovo. They lived with us for 2 years because of ethnic cleansing. A beautiful family that never caused anyone any harm, but again, they were driven from their property, from their home, simply because they were Muslim, by the Christians who didn't want Muslims in their area. And again, they lived with us for 2 years. I think Brahim, the husband, is like a brother to me now, and certainly his girls see me as an uncle, and it's been a wonderful thing, but it's terrible how it began. And so it is something, again, that I think we have to take very seriously. And I think normally in our country, we're doing actually a pretty good job with diversity. Most of us like each other. In fact, most of us love each other and get along pretty well. I have to say that I was at Mass this Sunday and looked around and saw how diverse, I'm from San Diego, how diverse we were, different races, ethnicities, cultures. And I think we do a pretty good job. However, I do think that there is an uptick at the moment of violent extremism. I think the numbers pointed out as we were talking about today. And then how do we address that in a way that doesn't violate our civil rights? I mean, one of the beautiful things about our country is we do have freedom of speech. And in fact, some of the views of the minority over the years have become now the views of the majority, and some of the views that we really cherish. For example, all men are created equal. We had to kind of spell that one out a little bit to mean not just white men with property, but certainly women and everybody else. We're all created equal. But I do see an upswing, and one of the things that we haven't talked about too much today that concerns me is the issue of cryptocurrency and how monies could be used without anybody following them. So I think we've done a good job of talking about everything else, the gaps, but we haven't talked much about that. Director, I'd like to ask you about cryptocurrency and how it could be used. I know it's used certainly in foreign extremism and terrorism, but what about domestic experience?
Thank you, Congressman. We brought it up. We felt it was important to bring it up. It's something we are tracking as a potential trend in domestic terrorism because of the traceability. It's encrypted. The technology behind it makes it very difficult to track and interrupt those plots, the money transfers, et cetera. As you all know in this committee, the financial transfers end up being a huge tool that we have in the law enforcement and Homeland Security sector at intercepting and detecting, deterring, stopping these events and incidents from happening. Very effective overseas at the traditional money channels, but when you talk about Bitcoin and you talk about any of the online encrypted currencies, they become very difficult to track as the transfer is happening, and who's doing it, where they're coming from. It can bounce off of all the different the tactics that are used online to mask the IP addresses and the locations of the routers, et cetera. And because of that, the domestic terrorism perpetrators in our country are aware of that. They're seeing that from a foreign side that they're using. Again, I mentioned Facebook and Telegram, but there are plenty other mediums that we're aware of and working with our federal partners to detect. They're seeing the effectiveness of being able to mask those movements. And so as cryptocurrency becomes more prevalent, the technology becomes easier to adapt and use, we do believe we'll see more of use of that in the domestic terror realm.
And that is one of my concerns. I do think that it's going to grow as we see that our financial system becomes more and more dependent on cryptocurrency. It's very small at the moment, but again, it is a perfect medium to be able to hide money, move it around, as you just said. And I think it's already used in human trafficking. We know that. And I think it's also going to be used in domestic terrorism more and more unless we're able to do that. I do have the same concerns, though, that some of my colleagues have on the other side. I trust government generally, but I don't want government to be so intrusive that it's in everybody's lives at all the moments and all the times. I mean, I think a lot of Americans are concerned about that also. So how do we do it in such a way that we were able to track this money, but at the same time not be so involved in their lives, Americans' lives, that they feel that, you know, it's government intrusion that shouldn't be there?
So I'll start by saying that my agency and I respect the rights of Americans, and first and foremost. That becomes part of our goal. We need to protect and defend our homeland, but we need to be mindful of those rights that are guaranteed to us in our Constitution, Bill of Rights, et cetera. So we'll start out with that. But the second piece is we have to put stringent, oversight in place. I'm supportive of that, making sure that the right people are aware of what's happening in a way that represents our country and our citizenry. And then two is the processes that we put in place to detect those, to monitor and track the transfers and all those online presence we talked about. If we get the processes right, and in conjunction with the right amount of oversight, I think we can get to the right answer to protect and defend our country.
Thank you. My time is concluded. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Timmons, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank all of you for taking the time to come and testify before us today on this important issue. My background, I was a prosecutor for 4 years. I prosecuted domestic violence, white-collar crime, had a number of murders, armed robberies. I was a state senator for 2 years, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about how to make our society safer. So I'm convinced that one of the biggest challenges we face right now is a lack of interconnectivity and standardization of law enforcement. So federal, state, local agencies, particularly in South Carolina, and I'll use domestic violence as an example. When we pull the reports statewide for domestic violence in South Carolina, you will see arbitrary lines that are, there's no socioeconomic, there's no justification for the difference between one neighborhood versus another, other than the fact that the incident reporting system is vastly different. The way that law enforcement's operating is vastly different. And I'm just convinced that if we can get all the law enforcement in this country at all the different levels to work together in a meaningful way, to share information, to standardize and integrate their efforts, we will take the biggest step forward. And then at that point, if we are able to get additional information from financial institutions, we'll be in a better position. But I think that this is a step ahead of where we need to be focusing. So I'm of the opinion that the first thing we can do to make us safer is something similar to after 9/11, where we have all these law enforcement failures. And so after 9/11, we had intelligence failures. So we created a new framework. We encouraged them to share more. Whether that worked is another conversation. But I'm convinced that we need to have that conversation with law enforcement in this country. And it seems that New Jersey is doing a good job at this. I mean, could you talk more about the way that you've increased interconnectivity between the various law enforcement agencies?
Sure, I can. Thank you, Congressman. And Congressman Gottheimer knows this from being a champion of law enforcement in New Jersey, certainly. So I'm sure he can add some color to my comments as well. I'll tell you this. I mentioned it was unique. So in other states, there's multiple fusion centers, oftentimes multiple entities responsible for a variety of suspicious threats. You named a lot of them just from a criminal side, but then bridging it into the terrorism side. In New Jersey, every single suspicious activity report that's filed, from the local level, it'd be from the community to law enforcement, and then all the way up to the federal side. So including the FBI and our key federal partners, all that's funneled into one location at our state's fusion center. It's called the ROC, the Regional Operations Intelligence Center. And my detectives sit co-located with the New Jersey State Police. And every single suspicious activity is filed in one system. And when they hit the button that says we've accepted it as a suspicious report, it goes to every single entity that needs it. So if it's a small local township, if it's the FBI, they all will see it immediately. And if it becomes a federal case, the FBI can then pull it into the eGuardian system and make it a federal case. But it's all done in coordination, so there's zero gaps between those two. And that's how we handle the suspicious activity reporting. But the other piece revolves around how we operate in blue sky days, the good days. And that becomes very important. And what I mean by that is we all know each other. We're not exchanging business cards in a command post. As was mentioned in my biography, I worked for the CIA, not the Culinary Institute of America, the other one. And I can tell you that any successes that I was a part of in my career were because of teamwork and partnership, and because we knew our counterparts, again, foreigners and our key colleagues in America, we knew them beforehand. We knew the plan. We knew what we were going to talk about, what we were going to have to do objective-wise. And we bring that same mindset to the table in New Jersey. So I think those two things combined really are effective.
So you would say that the tragedy in Parkland, the law enforcement failures in Parkland, that would not be possible in New Jersey because of the systems you'll have in place?
I'm reticent to say nothing would be possible. It's hypothetical. I can tell you that our systems are in place, are robust, and I'm confident in their ability to prevent one of these attacks from happening.
And when y'all were going from the previous system, which was, I would imagine, far less connected, far less integrated, to this system, what were the challenges? Was it money? Was it power? All the different law enforcement agencies don't want to give up their area. Yeah. What were the biggest challenges to transition?
I think you just hit it right on the head. It becomes a political equation of people in ownership of information, the information sharing, et cetera. And those stovepipes can be very difficult to break down. The personalities got in place, I think, at the right time in New Jersey, have continued to be in place to help work and guide our agencies, again, federal, state, and local, together to work towards that common goal. And the money piece is huge. Again, it's been very focused on specific acts of terrorism, physical threat. That's where broadening out and getting more funding available towards some of the other pieces, the online side, some of the technology behind AI and the database network, et cetera. That money can go further and be applied in a better way. But the funding at the front end, while there, wasn't as coordinated. I think we've really tightened that up over time and look forward to more.
Thank you for sharing a success story, and I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Himes, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have just one question, and I apologize if you covered this in your earlier testimony. I was at a different hearing. My question is, and I think I'll direct it first to Ms. Miller. The CRS report makes reference to the fact that domestic terrorist financing is really fragmented and probably not very large. But I'm just wondering, start with you, Ms. Miller, are we seeing any indications that any of these groups have access to resources, in excess of 5 figures that would come from wealthy individuals, from businesses, perhaps from sources abroad?
Thank you for that question. So first, specifically for the CRS domestic terrorism report, I'm not the author of that, and that specific questions to that I'll route to that author. But I would like to say one of the key studies that's public on financing of domestic terrorism was done by the ADL.
Yeah, I saw that. I was going to go to Mr.
Right.
Selim next. Yeah, it's referenced in the report.
And so that, from the public information I've seen, the study that they conducted said that there wasn't a lot of evidence of wealthy benefactors, although there were a few individual cases, which maybe you'd like to elaborate on.
Yeah, Mr. Selim, your organization wrote the report. Yeah, want to add anything to that?
So, Congressman, thank you for your question. We've done a lot of robust research and analytics on this, as cited by Director Maples and others here on this panel. 4 categories I'd just point out to answer your specific question. The majority of funding that we've seen has, in fact, been self-funding with individuals' own finances from their jobs, businesses, et cetera. Director Maples had some excellent examples of criminal activity, illicit criminal activity to finance extremism across the ideological spectrum, as well as another key example that he used was the bartering, the use of different types of cards, gift cards, et cetera. And last but not least, which is the kind of the crowd platform to fund this type of extremism.
Yeah, my question, thank you. My question was more, are we seeing capability or any of those sources capable of generating, just to pick an arbitrary number, anything over, let's just say $100,000 in assets?
I'd have to double check. I don't believe we've documented any such individual single contribution.
And do you feel like we've got the capability through the banking monitoring systems and whatnot that if all of a sudden one of these capabilities developed, a dark philanthropist wanted to inject $5 million into some group, or all of a sudden businesses around the country in some networked way were providing cash, would we see that?
Sir, it's my assessment that the command and control structure of extremist movements is extremely limited, and the websites and the entities that they've put out to solicit funding have failed not because financial institutions have taken robust measures or those security procedures are in place. They failed because their business models are fundamentally bad and morally bankrupt. So they're not able to get the crowdsourcing and the funding and the push behind it. Credit card companies won't finance them. They can't link to PayPal and other sites. So their business models are really bad. in a kind of a dark web covert scenario that you're alluding to, if there's a cash injection, I believe that could be a significant threat stream, but we've yet to see that to date.
It sort of feels like, for all the reasons you're outlining, that some organized financing structure would be hard to build, but it's not impossible that somebody internationally, individual or a sovereign, acting covertly, or again some malign philanthropist might decide to do it domestically. But we're not seeing that right now.
Not to my knowledge.
May I add something?
Yes, of course.
The Southern Poverty Law Center is beginning to look at donor-advised funds, which, from our initial analysis, is showing that very thing is happening. A report showed that $11 million went to 34 different organizations that the center identifies as hate groups. Now, they may not be the domestic terrorist groups. They may not be the people on the ground.
Did you say 11 million?
That is correct.
From a single source?
Between 2014 and 2017, to specific donor advised funds, charitable contributions. So when you ask your question, could there be a philanthropist who is seeking to fund a particular, maybe ideology as opposed to a specific group on the ground, that is happening, right? VDARE Foundation, and VDARE is a quite popular white nationalist group. We showed that they received about $50,000 through these donor-advised funds because people are able to keep their anonymity when they're contributing to these funds.
Yeah,
so
great.
there is a connection, but not directly to what we would call the domestic terrorist groups. But it's important to note that they influence those people on the ground, right? So if they can give money to the more legitimate organizations who produce and distribute the rhetoric, then it will get to domestic terrorists on the ground.
Okay, thanks very much. My time's expired.
Okay.
Thank you. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Gonzalez, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for our panel for being here today. First, I want to commend Mr. Selim on what you said at the very end of your written testimony, which I think speaks to the heart of this, which is that it requires a whole-of-society approach, what we're talking about. And additionally, Director Maples, when I read your testimony, I thought it's just the facts. You go through different organizations, right and left, which I personally don't think is a useful way of categorizing these people, but that just says this is the extremist activity that's taking place in the homeland writ large, and providing that. Because extremism of all kinds is on the rise, and that's been documented, and it's something that we should be equally outraged, whether it happens on the left or the right. We should be equally disgusted when El Paso happens as Dayton, which are two different ideologies. And I think the fastest way to make sure that we do absolutely nothing on this issue is to politicize it, which I've seen, unfortunately, from some in this hearing today. I believe in my heart that the vast majority of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle do not support, for example, Antifa or other organizations, or the comments from a Bernie Sanders surrogate that showed up on the internet. I know that. And I know that on this side, we are outraged over white nationalism. And if we can't have that dialogue in concert, we will not solve this. And so I hope that we'll be able to put the partisanship aside and actually work on it. When I look at the challenge, I think, at least with respect to this hearing, I think there's a definition question and then there's a technical question. So the definition, what are we going to qualify as domestic terror? And Ms. McCord, I want to start with you. So you talked about changing the definition, and basically it's saying killing, kidnapping, maiming, committing assault, resulting in serious bodily harm, et cetera, with the intent to, quote, intimidate or coerce a civilian population to influence the policy of a government, et cetera. So in your estimation, if we made that change, I think that would certainly pick up some of the white nationalist groups. Would that also pick up like inner city gang violence in your estimation?
So first of all, thank you for your question. That's actually not a change in the definition. That actually is the definition of domestic terrorism in the U.S. Criminal Code. It's just that there's not an offense connected to it. It's the same definition as the definition of international terrorism in the Criminal Code. The difference is that international terrorism either occurs abroad or occurs here domestically, and this is where so much confusion arises, but is inspired by or on behalf of a foreign terrorist organization, therefore having international connections.
Got it. Let me ask it differently. So I think we're in agreement that some of these white nationalist extremist groups should be in that bucket. Do you believe inner city gangs should be in that bucket as well?
So it's not about a bucket of groups, because the definition does not designate groups or organizations. What we're talking about as the definition and with a potential domestic terrorism statute, or just terrorism in the U.S. statute, is criminalizing activity, which may be of individuals or it may be of groups. So if you're talking about an inner city gang, we're not talking about designating a group. If you're talking about white nationalists,
individuals, right.
If the individuals were committing their crimes of violence with the intent to intimidate or coerce for purposes of sending sort of a political or ideological message, then maybe they'd fit. That's not what we typically see with inner city gangs. In my experience as a prosecutor, it was usually drug-related or something like that.
But to intimidate or coerce a civilian population?
Yes, or influence the policy of government through intimidation or coercion.
Okay, now shifting to the technical side, Ms. Miller, how could FinCEN leverage emerging technologies to help us overcome the needle in the haystack challenge, sort of the small dollar, fragmented financing component? Do you see FinCEN as being able to accomplish that?
Well, this is a difficult and challenging question that I'm sure FinCEN has grappled with. The challenge, as you phrase of the needle in the haystack, you're referring to using financial intelligence prior to an attack to prevent one?
Yeah, so basically this notion that there's a lot of people online and in our society who are saying a lot of things, but the gap between the rhetoric and the action, I think is sort of what I'm trying to get at, where you go from, okay, this person has been talking about different things online, and I'm running out of time, so I'll follow up. But that's what I'm trying to get at. How can we determine using technology tools, tech tools, how to solve that? There are a lot of people talking, there's a lot of anger and vitriol, but sort of that gap. How do we get there so that we stop the action from actually occurring? And I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. And Mr. Gonzalez and I are pretty much on the same page as to left, right. I mean, in Colorado, we had an environmental group that burned up a big restaurant at the top of Vail called Two Elk a number of years ago in a way to try to send a message about policy of our national forests. And obviously, just looking up at this board, we've had anti-Semitic, we've had murders related to abortion, we've had all sorts of kinds of things. So, and I apologize for missing most of your testimony. I'm just curious in all of this whether the RICO statutes could assist in any of this domestic terrorism type of policing, if you will. And it may be completely off-base kind of question, but we used those certainly against motorcycle gangs back in the day. And I don't know that we've used RICO too much for anything lately, but I'm just curious if anybody has a response to that. And then, because I've missed so much, I'm going to let you all talk about anything you want that you haven't been able to address to the questions. So, anybody got an answer to RICO? Yes.
I do think RICO is an important tool that law enforcement, and I'm sure, should be looking at using, and I'm sure the FBA is doing that. I think there are a couple of distinctions to draw, though, between using those type of criminal tools versus tools that are really directed at terrorism. And in part, it goes back to something I did mention earlier, is who are the investigators and the prosecutors? And the FBI, even before 9/11, but certainly since 9/11, has put tremendous resources into studying the terrorist threat, primarily studying the international terrorist threat, but more and more due to the needs, frankly, and the threat here in the Homeland, studying the domestic terrorist threat. And so terrorism is unique, and it is different than other types of criminal gangs or continuing criminal enterprises and those that engage in serial acts of violence and other types of crimes, oftentimes for financial gain, which is really what RICO has been directed to, predominantly. The motive for a terrorist offense is not financial gain at all. It is to intimidate and coerce. And so the experts who have spent their careers...
Yeah, but under RICO, does it have to be for financial gain? Is that an element of the statute? I don't think so.
No, it wouldn't be. So my only point, I was really trying to make a point about centering the investigations among those who are the most equipped to deal with them and study them. And I think the second point I wanted to make is something we've glossed over a little bit, which is that there are extremist groups here, but most of the acts of extremist domestic violence motivated by domestic ideologies that we've seen are not being perpetrated by people who say, I'm a member of X group, and maybe have never even done anything to suggest they are a member of the group. They're very much inspired by rhetoric out there, maybe inspired by other groups, maybe they've visited their Facebook page, maybe they've posted once or twice, but mostly these are people who on their own consume the rhetoric of hate groups and extremist groups and are motivated and inspired by that, much like HVEs, Homeland Violent Extremists, sometimes are inspired by ISIS and Al-Qaeda and foreign terrorist organizations. Similar type of inspiration, usually over social media, and then they go out and do something on their own.
Okay. Mr. Selim.
Sir, if I may just weigh in, the point you made on the map above us and here in the hearing room, this is actually ADL's heat map, and heat in this context stands for hatred, extremism, anti-Semitism, and terrorism. ADL has pioneered this type of proprietary data collection and digital visualization for partners at the federal, state, local, public sector, private sector level to use these type of tools to inform how, Mr. Gonzalez pointed out, communities can really come together in order to combat the threat of extremism and terrorism comprehensively. Sir, on your specific question, you said, what can we do? I'd like to offer 3 specific recommendations. Having this body closely examine and pass the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, passing the Jabara Hire No Hate Act, and significantly increase funding for the Nonprofit Security Grant Program and the DHS Office of Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention, and I'll yield to my co-panelists.
I'll just add.
You've got 17 seconds.
Okay, I'll be brief. Just one quick point that I wanted to make is ADL in the work that they do is truly supported what we're doing in New Jersey to get ahead of these incidents, and I want to make sure I cite Mr. Selim's work personally and then also from an organization perspective, and thank you.
Okay. I yield back to
Thank you. The gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate my friend, Mr. Cleaver, for holding this important hearing, and appreciate my friend, Mr. Hill, and as a ranking member for allowing me to weigh in on this important topic. I want to focus on this recent wave of anti-Semitic violence, the attacks in New York and New Jersey, Pittsburgh last year, San Diego. I don't care if it's right-wing extremism or left-wing extremism. This is extremism. It is wrong. It's not and shouldn't be a partisan issue. It's right versus wrong. And I am greatly concerned with the growing network of non-governmental organizations in the United States and other Western countries, which in recent years have engaged in an organized and well-coordinated boycott, divestment, and sanctions, or BDS campaign against Israel. Mr. Selim, I know your organization is very focused on this. These NGOs often claim to stand for Middle East peace or against Israeli apartheid or for justice for Palestinians in so-called occupied territory. But the reality is that many of these NGOs have direct financial ties to designated terrorist organizations, including Hamas and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. I want to draw your attention to Executive Order 13224, which is a post-9/11 executive order that President Bush signed. It directs Treasury, State, and Justice Departments to coordinate in order to cut off funding to designated terrorist organizations, block their assets, and prohibit any U.S. person or business from transacting with them. The current list of specially designated nationals contains thousands of individuals and entities that have ties to terrorism in Israel and in the Middle East. There is evidence that certain grassroots organizations based in the United States may have financial ties to Hamas and other SDNs. For example, the American Muslims for Palestine organization is headquartered in Palos Hills, Illinois, and describes its mission as, quote, supporting campus activism, as well as working in broad-based coalitions focused on BDS, unquote. According to testimony to Congress from a former Treasury Department terrorism finance analyst, at least 7 individuals who work for or on behalf of AMP have worked for or on behalf of organizations previously shut down or held civilly liable in the United States for providing financial support to Hamas. AMP is a prominent financial backer of Students for Justice in Palestine, a network of more than 100, quote, pro-Palestinian student groups across the U.S. which disseminate anti-Israel propaganda, often laced with inflammatory and at times combative rhetoric, unquote. That's from the Anti-Defamation League. Identifying and countering these types of groups through available authorities under 13224 must be a high priority for the federal government. So, Ms. McCord, in your testimony, you discussed some of the challenges with identifying and countering domestic extremist organizations due to, among other things, the First Amendment. How can the government do a better job of identifying and countering domestic groups like the ones I just mentioned, where there is evidence of financial ties to SDNs?
Well, when you're talking about organizations like Hamas, that is a designated foreign terrorist organization, and if there are organizations or individuals here in the United States that are providing material support or resources to Hamas, that's a very easy investigation for the Bureau to open and for Treasury and State to look into that, because that would directly violate U.S. criminal law. If we're talking about independent advocacy, by U.S.-based organizations that might support ideologies of foreign terrorist organizations, if it is not directed or funded by a foreign terrorist organization, that's a First Amendment right,
Sure.
and the Supreme Court has said so.
Sure, and I understand that. I'm sensitive, and I'm an advocate of the First Amendment, as we all are. The problem here is that there is documented evidence of financial support from designated terrorist organizations to some of these NGOs. And in July, Congressman Stivers and I sent a letter to OFAC asking for a briefing on their process for designating entities and how they use their authorities under 13224. And during that briefing, they made it very clear that in addition to OFAC, the FBI plays an important role in investigating domestic entities that may have ties to these foreign terrorist organizations. We have sought a follow-up briefing from the FBI to learn more about their procedures and made numerous requests for information, and they have yet to provide it. FBI has got a lot of problems right now. And we know that it's an important element of the construct of combating financing for terrorist groups that the FBI investigate this. So I'm very disappointed that the FBI is not being responsive to us, and that they declined to participate in this hearing, and we're going to continue to push the FBI to investigate this. And I yield back, and I appreciate being able to participate in this hearing.
Thank you. The gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, who is also the chair for the Subcommittee on Investor Protection, Entrepreneurship, and Capital Markets, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I want to pick up on the comments of the gentleman from Kentucky. A decade ago, I brought to the attention of the IRS an organization that was advertising on their website that you could get a tax deduction for giving money to Hamas. I still don't think they've acted. Well, I think they acted a few years ago, but it took them many years. But speaking of Hamas, if you go to the Hamas website, they'll instruct you as to how to make a donation using cryptocurrency. And so I want to focus on cryptocurrency a little bit, because if it works for Hamas, it'll work for the Nazis too. I've criticized cryptocurrency in this room before, a few of you are aware of that. And so I've been deluged with all of the argumentation of the fervent supporters of cryptocurrency. And if you read it, it's clear that one of the big pluses they have is that it weakens the U.S. federal government, evades the U.S. federal government. Mr. Zuckerberg was at that table just a couple of months ago. He says that when he creates a new cryptocurrency, Facebook will follow the Know Your Customer rules and the anti-money laundering rules, but then the paper published by his company says, and then we will have other business partners who will allow for anonymous accounts. So if the Libra ever becomes an efficient currency, Zuckerberg can say that he's not facilitating anonymous accounts. He's just having his business partners do it as part of a structure that he's created. And I would say that anonymous accounts and know your customer, there's no way to square those two things. So on October 21st of last year, FinCEN Director Kenneth Blanco gave remarks at Georgetown University event where he discussed cryptocurrency and illicit finance. During his remarks, he indicated that those in the crypto businesses are arguing that they are incapable of complying with FinCEN's anti-money laundering and know your customer rules, and therefore should be exempted. Director, I'll ask the entire panel, have you seen evidence of domestic extremist organizations moving toward or exploring the use of cryptocurrencies in order to disguise their financial transactions?
I'll begin by saying I did cite that in my opening remarks and certainly my written testimony in a little more robust way. We have seen evidence of that. One clear-cut example is the Charlottesville example that I cited. There was a cryptocurrency exchange, and we do see evidence that domestic terror groups are realizing that foreign groups, like you mentioned, foreign terrorism groups like Hamas, like you mentioned, have been operating using Bitcoin due to the encryptions, due to the difficulties in tracking those transactions. So we're seeing it. Cryptocurrency, of course, is a small subset of the American financial system, the world financial system. And
if I can interrupt, I'm not sure that you'll ever be able to buy a ham sandwich for Bitcoin. But Facebook's a powerful organization. If they go with the Libra, it will no longer be an inefficient system. I also want to point out that we really have to focus on preventing these organizations from getting military-style weapons. We've seen a lot of terrorist attacks. They don't involve an amount of money that is hard to get. They should, but they involve weapons that should be impossible to get. And while we got to turn off the finances to these organizations, we also have to focus, or at least another committee has to focus on that. I'm also concerned, though, about the definition of what is a terrorist group. This country could move radically to the right or the left. In fact, I think it may be given that choice in just a few months. It could move, we on the left think it's going to move that way. It could move as far to the right of Trump as Bernie is to the left of Trump. Do the statutes allow a president to designate pro-choice organizations or abortion providers as terrorists if they declare that the unborn is somehow a group subject to oppression? Are our statutes clear enough on that to prevent that from happening, no matter who's elected president? Does anybody have a comment? Ms. McCord.
Yes, thank you. Right now, there's no authority, statutory or otherwise, for designating domestic organizations as terrorist organizations. And as I indicated in my oral testimony, I think it would, even if such authority were provided either through statute or through executive order, I think it would run afoul of the First Amendment in most circumstances.
Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Cleaver, and I appreciate the work that you've done on this issue. It's an important issue, but it is tough to get at. As the chair of the task force on FinTech and someone who's worked with FinCEN in the past on terrorist financing, we have a whole framework there where the KYC that we use in the international context is fed by, is also assisted by, suspicious transaction reports that are filed with FinCEN cash transaction reports that are filed with FinCEN. I think there were 15.8 million CTRs filed by financial institutions in 2019 and 1.5 million suspicious activity reports. So what they tell me at FinCEN in the past, they've said, in order to find a needle in a haystack, we need a haystack. So they get all this data, and then they're able to dig through it. We don't, I mean, let me ask you, we don't get nearly the volume of information on the domestic side. You know, I'm trying to figure out how do we get at this in terms of trying to identify a prospective domestic terrorist. We don't have a similar mechanism to do that, do we? I mean, we don't ask local banks, even traditional banks. Let's put mobile banking aside for a minute. We don't even get that information from our local banks, do we? Yeah,
Sir, if I may, thank you for your question, Congressman. I think there are a number of steps to address your question that can lead up to reporting that eventually creates the better ecosystem of data to prevent against domestic terrorism and extremism, improving reporting mechanisms, increasing transparency, enhancing the training for trust and safety teams across financial institutions and financial service platforms online. These are the core building blocks to ensure that if and when reporting to regulatory or state and local law enforcement is required, that reporting is accurate and substantively helpful.
I see. I'm not saying we should go there in terms of vetting domestic, U.S. citizens without probable cause or anything like that in a fashion that would be intrusive. I'm just trying to get my arms around how do we, for these low dollar amounts, and with the emergence of mobile banking, which doesn't readily acknowledge the existence of borders, how might we better approach this problem from a domestic standpoint? Are there measures out there that you think might be helpful, Ms. Miller? And we greatly appreciate the support that Congress gets from CRS. We really do. The Congressional Research Service, we all utilize your subject matter experts on a regular basis. We really do appreciate your great work. But are there specific measures that you might suggest Congress might take up in order to more accurately predict, something like this from emerging?
Well, I'm going to make 2 points. One, which I'll make first, is about the financial system writ large first.
Yeah.
It is that the more transparency there is in the financial system, the easier it can be for law enforcement, FinCEN, intelligence agencies to track the financing of individuals, whether it's international or domestic terrorists or others. There is an issue with legislation in this Congress, the beneficial ownership bills that your committee worked with, that does address, in a way you've chosen, the issue of financial transparency in the system as a whole. The purpose of it is to try, as I read it, to prevent illicit actors or others from using legal entities to store money, move money, hide money under assumed names without any sort of identification procedures about who really controls those. Yeah. It's possible the other prosecutors or law enforcement officials might have something to say. There have been views on both sides, concerns about privacy or cost, but again, that issue of financial transparency in the system writ large is relevant here. On the question of data and looking for, preventing the next attack, I would say also it's important to think first, what type of data, what type of information is it that would be most useful? And then second, who in the current system has access to that data and at what point in time? It seems to me that with changing technology, we're less constrained if data itself is standardized in looking at very large amounts of data. The bigger question is, what type of data is useful, who has access to that data, and when and how?
That's great. Mr. Chairman, thank you for your indulgence, and I yield back.
Thank you. I want to really express appreciation to the witnesses. You've been great, and we appreciate the information you've given us. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask all witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. I'd also like to say that we're going to receive some additional information from other religious organizations not necessarily represented here and judicatories. The hearing is now adjourned unless there's any critical information that you can give us that we don't already have. Thank you. We're adjourned.